Jake Morrison wiped the sweat from his forehead as he guided his starship Iron Hawk through the asteroid field surrounding Kepler 442c. The cargo escort mission had been routine and boring, just the way he liked it these days. 3 merchant ships safely delivered to the mining colonies, payment transferred to his account, and no one shooting at him for once. At 35 years old, Jake had seen enough combat to last several lifetimes. The Iron Hawk was not much to look at from the outside. Scratched hull plating, mismatched engine pods, and weapon mounts that had been welded on by different mechanics across a dozen worlds. But she was fast, reliable, and had kept Jake alive through 5 years of mercenary work in the frontier sectors. The ship's interior reflected its owner's practical nature, with worn but functional equipment and spare parts scattered across every available surface. Jake was plotting his course to the next job when the distress beacon lit up his communications. Bored, the signal was weak and intermittent, coming from somewhere on the planet's surface below. Most mercenaries would have ignored it, since distress calls in this sector usually meant pirates trying to lure unsuspecting ships into traps. Jake had fallen for that trick exactly once in his career and still carried the scar on his left shoulder as a reminder, but something about this signal felt different. The frequency was wrong for human equipment, and the modulation pattern didn't match any known pirate codes. Jake had learned to trust his instincts during his years as a soldier in the Earth Defense Corps and later as a freelance warrior. Those instincts had kept him breathing. When smarter men had died, he changed course toward the planet, activating his ship's passive sensors to scan for other vessels in the area. Kepler 442c was officially uninhabited, a rocky world with a thin atmosphere and surface temperatures that fluctuated wildly between scorching heat and freezing cold. The kind of place where you could hide a small army if you needed to, or where someone might crash land if they were running from trouble. The Iron Hawk's sensors picked up the wreckage about 20 kilometers from where the distress signal originated. It was definitely a spacecraft, but the design was unlike anything in Jake's extensive database of human, pirate, or corporate vessels. The hull was smooth and organic-looking, with curves that seemed to flow like water rather than the angular lines preferred by human engineers. Whatever had built this ship understood both beauty and function in ways that human designers still struggled with. Jake landed the Iron Hawk on a flat stretch of ground about half a kilometer from the crash site. He suited up in his combat armor, a battered but reliable set of military-grade protection that had seen action on a dozen different worlds. The armor's heads-up display showed atmospheric readings that were barely within human tolerance levels. He could breathe the air, but it would taste terrible and leave him with a headache after a few hours. The walk to the crash site took 15 minutes across broken terrain littered with sharp rocks and patches of some kind of crystalline formation that crunched under his boots. The crashed ship had gouged a deep furrow in the ground before coming to rest against a low hill. One entire side of the vessel had been torn open, revealing an interior that glowed with soft blue light. Jake approached carefully with his rifle ready. The ship's hull was made of some kind of metal that seemed to shift color depending on the angle of view, cycling through shades of silver, blue, and purple. He had never seen anything like it in 20 years of military and mercenary service. The technology was clearly advanced, possibly even more sophisticated than the best human engineering inside the ship. He found her. The alien was unconscious and badly injured, lying in what appeared to be the remains of a command chair. She was roughly humanoid in shape, but clearly not human. Her skin had a translucent quality that revealed faint patterns of light moving beneath the surface like slow lightning. Her features were elegant and angular, with large eyes that remained closed and hair that seemed to be made of fine silver threads. She was beautiful in a way that was completely alien, yet somehow familiar. Jake's military medical training kicked in automatically. He checked for vital signs using his suit's scanners and was relieved to find that she was alive but in critical condition. Her left arm was broken and there was evidence of internal bleeding. Without immediate treatment, she would die within hours. He activated his suit's universal translator and tried speaking to her. The device struggled with her language, producing only fragments of meaning. Something about running, danger, and someone called Mother. The alien's eyes opened briefly, revealing irises that swirled with the same colors as her skin. She looked at Jake with what he interpreted as surprise and fear before losing consciousness. Again, Jake made a decision that would change everything. He carefully lifted the injured alien and carried her back to his ship. The Ironhawk's medical bay was basic but functional, designed to treat human injuries in the field. He would have to improvise treatment for an alien physiology he knew nothing about, but leaving her to die was not an option as he worked to stabilize her condition. Jake noticed that her skin color seemed to shift with her emotional state. When he first found her, the skin had been pale and dim, but as her vital signs improved under his care, faint patterns of light began to move beneath the surface again. It was like watching Aurora dancing under ice. The universal translator finally managed to decode enough of her language to piece together fragments of her story. Her name was Zara, and she was some kind of princess from a place called the Valerian Empire. She had been fleeing from rebels who had captured her mother, the Queen. Her ship had been damaged in the escape and crashed while trying to reach friendly territory. Jake had heard of the Valerian Empire in his military briefings years ago. They were one of humanity's few alien allies, having provided crucial support during the Centauri Wars when Earth was nearly overrun by hostile forces. The Valerians had shared technology and resources that helped turn the tide of that conflict, earning the eternal gratitude of the human government. As Princess Zara's condition stabilized, Jake found himself studying her features and wondering what kind of civilization could produce such elegant beings. Her injuries were healing faster than any human would manage, and her vital signs suggested a physiology that was both more resilient and more complex than human biology. Whatever evolutionary path had produced the Valerians had clearly taken a very different direction from humanity. When Zara finally regained consciousness several hours later, she looked at Jake with those swirling eyes and spoke in heavily accented, but understandable human language. Her first words were not thanks for saving her life, but a desperate plea for help in rescuing her mother from the rebels who had destroyed everything she had ever known. Princess Zara sat up slowly on the medical bed, her crystalline skin still pale but showing more of the flowing light patterns that seemed to indicate health in her species. Jake had spent the last 6 hours keeping her alive with improvised medical treatments, and seeing her conscious again felt like a small victory. She studied him with those strange, swirling eyes, trying to understand why a human had risked his life to save a complete stranger. Jake handed her a cup of water and watched as she drank carefully. The universal translator was working better now that it had more of her language to analyze, though her accent still made some words difficult to understand. She spoke slowly, choosing her words with the precision of someone who had learned human language from textbooks rather than conversation. Her story came out in pieces over the next several hours. The Valerian Empire had been peaceful and prosperous under Queen Lorana's rule for over 2 decades. The Queen had established trade relationships with dozens of alien species and had been one of the first rulers to recognize humanity as equals rather than primitive newcomers to galactic civilization. This progressive attitude had made her many enemies among the more traditional Valerian nobility. General Vex had been the Queen's most trusted military commander until economic problems began to strain the empire. A series of failed harvests on the agricultural worlds, combined with increased raids by space pirates, had created widespread discontent among the population. Vex had skillfully exploited this unrest, spreading rumors that the Queen's alliance with aliens was weakening traditional Valerian values and inviting foreign interference. The coup had happened quickly and brutally. Vex's supporters in the military had seized key installations across the empire while loyal forces were engaged in anti-piracy operations on the frontier. Queen Lorena had been captured in her palace while Zara was attending a diplomatic conference on a distant world. Only a warning from a loyal guard had allowed the princess to escape before Vex's forces arrived to arrest her. Zara's ship had been damaged during the escape when rebel fighters intercepted her near the system's edge. She had managed to jump to hyperspace, but the damaged engines had brought her out of FTL travel randomly. leaving her stranded in this remote system with no way to call for help. If Jake had not found her, she would have died alone on this barren world while her mother faced execution at the hands of the rebels. Jake listened to her story while performing routine maintenance on his ship's systems. He had heard similar tales of political upheaval across the galaxy, and they usually ended badly for everyone involved. Smart mercenaries stayed far away from civil wars and succession disputes since there was rarely enough money to justify the risks involved. But something about Zara's situation bothered him in ways he could not easily explain. The princess noticed his reluctance and began to share more details about her mother and their relationship. Queen Lorena had not always been a distant royal figure focused on affairs of state. When Zara was younger, before the responsibilities of ruling had consumed so much time, mother and daughter had been genuinely close. They had spent hours together in the palace gardens, with the queen teaching her daughter about botany, history, and the complex art of diplomacy. Those days had ended when Zara reached adulthood and began her own training in statecraft and military affairs. The demands of preparing to eventually rule the empire had separated them, creating a professional distance that both regretted but neither knew how to bridge. Zara's last conversation with her mother had been an argument about trade policies, and now she feared she might never have the chance to apologize or tell the queen how much she loved her. Jake found himself thinking about his own family relationships, long since severed by years of military service and mercenary work. His parents had died while he was fighting in the Centauri Wars, and he had never taken the time to maintain friendships or romantic connections. The idea of losing someone important without having the chance to make things right resonated with him more than he cared to admit. Zara also revealed practical information that made Jake reconsider his initial plan to simply drop her off at the nearest Valyrian embassy. She possessed access codes to hidden royal treasury vaults scattered across the empire, resources that could fund a rescue operation if they could be reached. More importantly, she claimed that Queen Lorena had been gathering intelligence about a massive military buildup by the Scorith Empire. Humanity's most dangerous enemy, the Scorith, were a warrior species that viewed all other life forms as either slaves or obstacles to be destroyed. They had been pushing against human space for decades, testing defenses and probing for weaknesses. If they were planning a major offensive, Earth's government would pay almost any price for advance warning about their intentions and capabilities. Jake realized that helping Zara might serve multiple purposes beyond simple altruism. Rescuing Queen Lorena could restore a valuable human ally while potentially uncovering intelligence that could save millions of human lives. The personal satisfaction of reuniting a mother and daughter would be an added bonus to what was becoming a strategically important mission. The decision became easier when Zara activated a damaged holographic projector she had salvaged from her ship's wreckage. The device showed images of Queen Lorena during various state functions and private moments, revealing a woman who carried the weight of leadership with grace and dignity. In the private recordings, Jake could see the genuine affection between mother and daughter, the easy laughter and shared moments that political duties had gradually reduced to mere memories. Zara's skin color shifted to deeper blues and purples as she watched the recordings, what Jake was beginning to recognize as expressions of sadness and loss in Valyrian emotional displays. She spoke quietly about growing up in the palace, about feeling torn between her love for her mother and her resentment of the royal duties that kept them apart. The rebellion had made her realize how much she had taken their relationship for granted. Jake made his decision while watching Zara's reaction to those family memories. He would help her rescue Queen Lorena, not for money or political advantage, but because some things were more important than a mercenary's usual calculations of risk versus reward. The galaxy was full of people who had lost their families to war and politics, and if he could prevent one more tragedy, perhaps it would balance some small part of the destruction he had witnessed and participated in during his military career. The next morning, Jake began planning their route to Valyrian space while Zara worked to repair her damaged equipment. She proved to be surprisingly knowledgeable about starship systems and weapons technology, skills that most princesses would never need to learn. Her technical expertise, combined with her knowledge of Valyrian military protocols and palace security systems, would be essential for any rescue attempt. They spent 2 days modifying the Iron Hawk systems and preparing false identification documents that would allow them to enter Valyrian territory without being detected by rebel forces. Jake taught Zara basic human combat techniques, while she showed him how to operate Valyrian technology that might be useful during the mission by the time they departed Kepler 4442c. Jake and Zara had begun to function as a team rather than a human mercenary reluctantly helping an alien refugee. She had proven herself to be intelligent, capable, and determined to save her mother regardless of the personal cost. Jake found himself respecting her courage and dedication, qualities that reminded him of the best soldiers he had served with during his military career. The jump into Valyrian space went smoothly thanks to the false identification codes Zara had helped Jake program into his ship's systems. The Iron Hawk appeared on rebel sensors as a routine cargo hauler carrying mining equipment to the outer colonies, exactly the kind of unremarkable vessel that security forces would ignore unless they had specific reasons for suspicion. Jake had learned during his military service that the best way to hide was often in plain sight. Zara guided them through the complex hyperspace routes that connected the major Valyrian worlds, pointing out patrol patterns and checkpoint locations that would have been impossible for an outsider to navigate safely. Her knowledge of the Empire's infrastructure was comprehensive, covering everything from fuel depot locations to communication relay stations that could be used to monitor their progress through the system. The Valyrian Empire was more beautiful than Jake had expected based on the military briefings he had received years earlier. The worlds they passed showed evidence of advanced terraforming technology that had created perfect atmospheric conditions and stunning landscapes. Cities were built to harmonize with natural features rather than dominating them, and even the industrial facilities had an elegant aesthetic that most human engineers would never think to attempt but beneath the beauty. Signs of the Civil War were everywhere. Military patrols had tripled in frequency, and several civilian stations showed damage from recent fighting. Zara's skin colors darkened to deep purples and grays as she pointed out locations where battles had been fought. Friends had died, and the empire she loved had begun to tear itself apart under General Vex's rebellion. Their destination was Crystalline Reach, the ancient fortress that had served as the royal palace for over 1,000 years. The massive structure was built into the side of a mountain on the Empire's capital world, its towers and walls carved from the same crystalline formations that grew naturally throughout Valyrian space. According to Zara's intelligence sources, this was where the rebels were holding Queen Lorena while they prepared for a massive public execution, designed to legitimize Vex's new government. Jake studied the fortress through his ship's long-range sensors and immediately understood why the rebels had chosen it as their stronghold. The structure was nearly impregnable by conventional assault, with energy shields, automated defense systems, and natural barriers that would make any direct attack suicidal. Worse, the fortress was surrounded by a city of over 10 million Valyrians, meaning that any rescue attempt would have to avoid civilian casualties. The execution was scheduled to take place in exactly 72 hours during a ceremony that would be broadcast across the entire empire. Vex intended to use Queen Lorena's death as a symbol of his power, while demonstrating what happened to those who opposed his new order. The timing was deliberate, giving potential resistance movements just enough notice to attempt desperate rescue operations that could be crushed publicly to further discourage opposition. Zara provided detailed intelligence about the fortress layout based on her childhood memories of living there. She knew every secret passage, hidden entrance, and security weakness that existed in the ancient structure. But the rebels had undoubtedly changed many of the security protocols since taking control, and Jake would have to account for modern detection systems that had been added to supplement the fortress's traditional defenses. The most challenging aspect of the mission was not getting into the fortress, but getting out alive with Queen Lorena. The rebels would expect rescue attempts and would have prepared countermeasures designed to trap any rescue teams inside the fortress where they could be captured or killed. Jake needed a plan that would confuse and overwhelm the defenders while creating multiple escape routes that could be used if the primary plan failed. Jake spent 18 hours developing a strategy that combined human, tactical flexibility with Valyrian technology and Princess Zara's intimate knowledge of the target. The plan was complex and relied heavily on timing, but it exploited weaknesses in traditional Valyrian military thinking that might give them the edge they needed against numerically superior forces. Valyrian military doctrine emphasized honor, direct confrontation, and overwhelming force applied at decisive points. Their tactics were elegant and effective against enemies who followed similar principles, but they had never faced an opponent who was willing to use deception, misdirection, and asymmetric warfare as primary weapons. Jake intended to exploit that weakness by making the rebels respond to threats that did not exist while ignoring the real danger until it was too late. The first phase of the plan involved creating chaos across the entire capital city using a series of coordinated diversions. Jake had fabricated dozens of small explosive devices and programmed autonomous drones to deploy them at random locations throughout the urban area. The explosions would be carefully calibrated to cause maximum noise and confusion while minimizing actual damage to civilian infrastructure while security forces scrambled to respond to what would appear to be a massive terrorist attack. Jake and Zara would infiltrate the fortress using one of the secret passages that Zara remembered from her childhood. The passage had been sealed centuries ago, but could be reopened with the right tools and explosives. More importantly, it was located in a section of the fortress that current security systems did not monitor because the rebels assumed it was inaccessible once inside. They would have to move quickly through areas of the fortress that Zara knew intimately, but that had probably been modified since the rebellion began. Jake had studied human prison break techniques and adapted them for alien architecture, focusing on speed and stealth rather than the direct confrontation that Valyrian forces would expect from any rescue attempt. The most dangerous part of the mission would be the actual rescue itself. Queen Lorena was being held in the fortress's deepest levels, surrounded by multiple layers of security that included both automated systems and live guards. Jake would have to neutralize those defenses without raising alarms that would bring the entire garrison down on their heads before they could escape. Zara had insisted on participating directly in the rescue. Despite Jake's concerns about her safety, she argued that her mother would not trust a human stranger and might resist rescue attempts unless Zara was there to convince her that Jake was an ally rather than another captor. More practically, Zara's knowledge of Valyrian security systems and her ability to interface directly with the fortress's computer networks would be essential for success. They spent their final day before the mission modifying equipment and rehearsing the plan until every movement had been practiced and timed precisely. Jake taught Zara how to use human weapons and combat techniques that would be effective in close quarters, while she showed him how to operate Valyrian technology that could give them advantages over the rebel forces. The night before the mission, Zara activated her holographic recordings of Queen Lorena one final time. Jake watched as mother and daughter shared moments of happiness that had been captured before political duties and civil war had separated them. He found himself hoping that they would have the chance to create new memories together, assuming that all three of them survived the next 24 hours as they approached the capital world. Jake performed final systems checks on the Iron Hawk while Zara prepared the equipment they would need for the infiltration. Both of them understood that they were about to attempt something that conventional military wisdom would consider impossible. But Jake had learned during his years as a soldier that impossible missions sometimes succeeded because enemies never prepared adequate defenses against attacks they believed could never happen. The fortress of Crystalline Reach grew larger on their view screen as they descended toward the planet's surface, its ancient towers gleaming in the light of the system's twin stars. Somewhere inside that massive structure, Queen Lorena waited for death or rescue, unaware that her daughter was risking everything to save her and restore their fractured relationship. The execution ceremony began at dawn with elaborate pageantry designed to demonstrate General Vex's power to the entire Valyrian Empire. Thousands of civilians filled the great plaza in front of Crystalline Reach, many forced to attend by rebel soldiers who wanted to ensure maximum attendance for the propaganda broadcasts. Jake watched the proceedings through his ship's sensors. While making final preparations for the rescue mission from their hidden position in the mountains surrounding the capital city, Jake could see the massive crowds gathered around the execution platform. General Vex appeared on the viewing screens, delivering a speech about the necessity of eliminating traitors and the beginning of a new era for the Valyrian people. His words were carefully crafted to justify the murder of their beloved queen while painting himself as a reluctant but necessary leader. Jake activated the first phase of his plan by launching dozens of small drones toward predetermined targets throughout the city. Each drone carried explosives that had been carefully calibrated to create maximum confusion while avoiding serious civilian casualties. The devices would detonate at random intervals over the next 3 hours, forcing security forces to spread their attention across the entire urban area rather than concentrating on fortress defense. The first explosions began as Jake and Zara made their way toward the secret entrance she had identified in the fortress's outer wall. The ancient passage had been sealed with crystalline formations that had grown naturally over the centuries, but Jake's military-grade cutting tools made quick work of the barrier. Zara's skin glowed with nervous energy as they prepared to enter the place. Where she had spent her childhood inside the passage, they moved quickly through corridors that had not seen use for hundreds of years. Zara guided them through the maze of tunnels with confidence despite the darkness, her enhanced Valyrian vision allowing her to navigate obstacles that would have stopped a human. Jake followed closely, his combat armor sensors scanning for security devices or patrol routes that might indicate the rebels had discovered these forgotten passages. The fortress's interior was both familiar and strange to Zara as they emerged from the tunnels into areas that had been modified extensively since the rebellion began. The elegant artwork and cultural displays she remembered from childhood had been replaced with military equipment and propaganda posters featuring General Vex's image. Her skin color shifted to angry reds and oranges as she saw how the rebels had defiled her family's ancestral home. They encountered their first security checkpoint as they moved toward the deeper levels where Queen Lyrana was being held. Jake's human reflexes and training proved superior to the alien guards who had been trained to expect conventional Valyrian tactics. He neutralized 3 rebels silently using combat techniques that exploited their unfamiliarity with human anatomy and fighting styles, while Zara disabled the alarm systems using her knowledge of the fortress's original design. Explosions from Jake's diversionary attacks were having their intended effect across the city. Security forces were responding to what appeared to be coordinated terrorist strikes at government buildings, communication centers, and military installations. The chaos was drawing personnel away from the fortress as commanders tried to assess whether they were facing a full-scale uprising or merely desperate rescue attempts deeper in the fortress. Jake and Zara encountered more sophisticated security measures that combined traditional Valyrian technology with modern innovations installed by the rebels. Jake's unconventional approach to problem-solving proved crucial, as he found ways to defeat systems that had been designed to stop conventional military assaults. His willingness to use explosives, electronic warfare, and psychological manipulation confused defenders who expected honorable direct confrontation. They finally reached the high-security detention level where Queen Lyrana was being held in a cell that had once been used to store the royal family's most precious artifacts. The irony was not lost on Zara, who remembered playing in these chambers as a child while her mother worked in the palace above. Now the same rooms had been converted into a prison designed to hold the empire's former ruler until her public execution. Queen Lyrana looked smaller and more fragile than Jake had expected based on the holographic recordings he had seen. Months of imprisonment had taken their toll on her health, and the elegant woman who had once commanded the respect of an entire empire now appeared almost broken by her captivity. But her eyes still held the intelligence and strength it had made her one of the galaxy's most effective leaders. The reunion between mother and daughter was intense and emotional despite the dangerous circumstances. Queen Lyrana's skin flowed with colors that Jake's translator identified as expressions of joy, relief, and overwhelming love as she embraced Zara for the first time in over a year. The queen spoke rapidly in a Valerian dialect that was too fast for the translation system to process completely, but Jake could understand the emotional content even without knowing the specific words. Queen Lyrana's initial reaction to Jake was cautious and suspicious, despite Zara's assurances about his trustworthiness. She had been betrayed by too many people she had trusted, and the idea of accepting help from a human mercenary seemed potentially dangerous. Jake understood her concerns and simply focused on cutting through the restraints that held her while Zara explained how they had met and why she believed Jake could be trusted. The Queen's attitude toward Jake changed dramatically when rebel forces discovered their escape and launched a massive response. Alarms echoed through the fortress as hundreds of soldiers began searching for the rescue team, while additional forces moved to block all possible escape routes. Jake's tactical brilliance became apparent as he guided them through the fortress. Using routes that avoided the heaviest concentrations of enemy forces, Jake's human ability to adapt quickly to changing circumstances proved invaluable, as they encountered unexpected obstacles and had to improvise solutions using whatever resources were available. He turned Valerian technology against itself, using security systems to track enemy movements while creating false signals that sent pursuit teams in wrong directions. His unconventional tactics consistently stayed ahead of rebel countermeasures during a running firefight in one of the fortress's main corridors. Queen Lyrana witnessed her daughter working seamlessly alongside Jake to overcome superior numbers of enemy soldiers. She saw how Zara had grown and changed during their separation, becoming more confident and capable than the uncertain young woman who had left for the diplomatic conference months earlier. The partnership between her daughter and the human warrior demonstrated skills and maturity that filled the queen with both pride and amazement. Jake's escape plan relied on reaching a maintenance shaft that connected to the fortress's power generation systems deep underground. From there, they could access service tunnels that led to the outer walls where Jake had hidden additional equipment for their extraction. But getting to that access point required fighting through increasingly heavy security while avoiding the massive search operation that was converging on their location. The final obstacle was a checkpoint guarded by an entire squad of rebel elite forces, who had been positioned specifically to prevent anyone from reaching the escape routes. Jake's solution was characteristically human in its creativity and ruthlessness. He overloaded several power conduits to create a localized electromagnetic pulse that disabled the rebels' electronic equipment while using the resulting confusion to eliminate the guards in close combat as they made their way through the service tunnels toward freedom. Queen Lyrana began to understand why humanity had earned such respect among the galaxy's older civilizations. Jake's combination of tactical flexibility, technological innovation, and sheer determination represented everything that made humans valuable allies and dangerous enemies. His willingness to risk his life for strangers demonstrated the same qualities that had made the human-Valerian alliance so successful during the Centauri Wars. They emerged from the fortress just as the diversionary explosions reached their climax across the capital city. Jake's carefully orchestrated chaos had drawn most of the available security forces away from their escape route, while the remaining defenders were too confused and disorganized to mount an effective pursuit. The Iron Hawk waited exactly where Jake had programmed it to land, its automated systems ready to launch immediately upon their arrival. Queen Lyrana looked back at Crystalline Reach as they lifted off, seeing her ancestral home disappear behind them as they escaped toward space and safety. But her attention was focused primarily on her daughter, who had risked everything to save her and had grown into the kind of leader the Empire would need for the challenges ahead. Queen Lyrana's recovery aboard the Iron Hawk was faster than Jake had expected, though he attributed that to Valerian physiology rather than his medical skills. Within hours of their escape from Crystalline Reach, she was alert and focused on the task of organizing resistance against General Vex's rebellion. Her first priority was establishing communication with loyalist forces scattered across the Empire who had been waiting for proof that their queen still lived. Jake found himself serving as an unofficial military advisor as Queen Lyrena and Princess Zara planned their counter-revolution. His human perspective on warfare proved invaluable because traditional Valyrian tactics had already failed against Vex's forces during the initial coup. The rebels had studied conventional Valyrian military doctrine and prepared countermeasures for every standard attack pattern their enemies might use. The Queen was initially skeptical of Jake's unconventional strategies, which emphasized speed, deception, and psychological warfare over the honorable direct confrontation preferred by Valyrian military tradition. But her daughter's enthusiastic support for the human warrior's methods, combined with the obvious success of their recent escape, convinced her to at least consider alternatives to traditional approaches. Jake's plan for retaking the Empire relied on the same principles that had made their rescue mission successful. Small, highly mobile forces would strike at carefully selected targets to create maximum disruption while avoiding the large-scale battles that would favor Vex's superior numbers. The key was convincing loyalist commanders to abandon their preference for glorious charges and decisive engagements in favor of hit-and-run tactics that would gradually wear down rebel morale. The first test of Jake's strategy came when a loyalist fleet of 30 ships engaged a rebel force twice their size near the industrial world of Valyrian Prime. Instead of the traditional formation battle that both sides expected, the loyalist commander followed Jake's advice and used the asteroid fields and gas giant rings in the system to launch surprise attacks from multiple directions while avoiding prolonged combat. The results exceeded everyone's expectations, including Jake's own optimistic projections. The rebel fleet, trained to expect conventional tactics, was completely unprepared for the psychological impact of facing an enemy that refused to fight according to established rules. After losing 8 ships to attacks they could not predict or counter effectively, the rebel commander withdrew despite having overwhelming numerical superiority. Word of the victory spread quickly through both loyalist and rebel communication networks, creating exactly the kind of morale boost that Jake had hoped to achieve. More importantly, the battle demonstrated that Vex's forces were not invincible when faced with tactics they did not understand. Within days, loyalist units across the Empire began requesting human military advisors to help them implement similar, unconventional strategies. Jake worked directly with Queen Lyrena to coordinate support from Earth's government, which was eager to strengthen its alliance with the Valyrian Empire while gaining access to intelligence about Scorith military activities. Human military advisors, advanced weapons, and electronic warfare equipment began flowing to loyalist forces as Earth committed to supporting the counter-revolution both openly and covertly. The war's turning point came during the battle for the fortress world of Thanagar, where General Vex had concentrated his most elite forces to protect the Empire's primary military academy. Jake personally led a combined human-Valyrian strike force in an assault that used every unconventional tactic he had developed during his military career. The attack began with a coordinated cyber warfare campaign that disabled rebel communication networks while flooding their systems with false information about loyalist force strengths and positions. Simultaneously, small infiltration teams captured key infrastructure points using stealth and surprise rather than overwhelming firepower. By the time rebel commanders realized they were under attack, their ability to coordinate an effective defense had been crippled. Jake's use of human psychological warfare techniques proved especially effective against Valyrian rebels who had no cultural framework for understanding or countering such methods. Fake radio broadcasts, deceptive troop movements, and carefully planted intelligence reports created paranoia and confusion that was as destructive as any physical weapon. Rebel units began surrendering when they became convinced they were surrounded by forces that existed only in Jake's imagination. Final assault on General Vex's command center was led jointly by Jake and Princess Zara, who had insisted on participating despite the obvious dangers. Her presence served both practical and symbolic purposes, demonstrating to rebel soldiers that their legitimate princes had returned to reclaim her birthright while providing Jake with someone who could interface directly with Valyrian technology. And security systems General Vex's capture marked the effective end of the rebellion, though scattered fighting continued for several weeks as the last holdout. Units either surrendered or were eliminated by Loyalist forces. The general himself proved to be a broken man who had convinced himself that his actions were necessary to save the empire from foreign influence, never understanding that his cure had been worse than the imagined disease. Queen Larena's restoration to the throne was celebrated across the empire with festivals that lasted for days. But the most meaningful moment for Jake came during a private ceremony in the palace gardens where mother and daughter had spent so much time together during Zara's childhood. He watched as they walked among their crystalline flowers, talking quietly about everything they had missed during their separation and making plans for the future they would build together. The relationship between Queen Lyrina and Princess Zara had been fundamentally changed by their shared ordeal. The formal distance that had developed during Zara's political education